Morning, everybody. Our Old Testament reading today is from Jeremiah 2, 5 to 14, and I'm reading it from the Living Bible. O Israel, says the Lord, why did your fathers desert me? What sin did they find in me that turned them away and changed them into fools who worship idols? They ignore the fact that it was I, the Lord, who brought them safely out of Egypt and led them through the barren wilderness, a land of deserts and rocks, of drought and death, where no one lives or even travels. And I brought them into a fruitful land to eat of its bounty and goodness, but they made it into a land of sin and corruption and turned my inheritance into an evil thing. Even their priests cared nothing for the Lord, and their judges ignored me. Their rulers turned against me, and their prophets worshipped Baal and wasted their time on nonsense. But I will not give up on you. I will plead for you to return to me, and we keep on pleading, and will keep on pleading, yes, even with your children's children in years to come. Look around you and see if you can find another nation anywhere that has traded its own old gods for new ones, even though their gods are nothing. Send to the west to the island of Cyprus. Send to the east to the deserts of Kedar. See if anyone there has ever heard so strange a thing as this. And yet, my people have given up their glorious God for silly idols. The heavens are shocked at such a thing and shrink back in horror and dismay. For my people have done two evil things. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and secondly, they have built for themselves broken cisterns that can't hold water. Why has Israel become a nation of slaves? Why is she captured and led far away? Our New Testament reading is from Romans 1, 18 to 25. But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, evil men who push away the truth from them. For the truth about God is known to them instinctively. God has put this knowledge in their hearts. Since earliest times, men have seen the earth and the sky and all God made, and have known of his existence and great eternal power. So they will have no excuse when they stand before God at Judgment Day. Yes, they knew about him all right, but they wouldn't admit it or worship him or even thank him for all his daily care. And after a while, they began to think up silly ideas of what God was like and what he wanted them to do. The result was that their foolish minds became dark and confused. Claiming themselves to be wise without God, they became utter fools instead. And then, instead of worshipping the glorious, ever-living God, they took wood and stone and made idols for themselves, carving them to look like mere birds and animals and snakes and puny men. So God let them go ahead into every sort of sex sin and do whatever they wanted to. Yes, vile and sinful things with each other's bodies. Instead of believing what they knew was the truth about God, they deliberately chose to believe lies. So they prayed to the things God made, but wouldn't obey the blessed God who made these things. This is the word of God.
So we're continuing on in our journey through the letter to the Romans, and we come to a pretty difficult little passage right now. When I say difficult, it's you got to take it in the broader context. But Paul has to walk down through a pretty tough acknowledgement of human evil and of the wrath of God. And we don't like talking about the wrath of God. We don't like talking about the wrath of anyone, to be perfectly honest, and there's good reasons for that. But we see here in this passage that there's a reason why God is angry, and that's because of the suppression of truth. Now, I've worked in 2 newspapers in my previous career as a graphic artist, and I was there for 8 years all up, and I saw firsthand how angry people can get when they feel that they've been misrepresented in a news story. In fact, I don't think I ever heard anyone ever say, that story was fair and they depicted me accurately. Most often, what I observed through angry letters and phone calls and threats of legal action against the paper and the journalist involved was extreme levels of anger at misrepresentation and of inaccuracies in the story that was about them. And according to Paul, in his letter to the Romans here, he says that the misrepresentation of truth by our humanity is one of the underlying reasons that stirs up the anger of God. And so he writes in the first chapter here, in verse 18, he says, "For the wrath of God is revealed, or is now being revealed, from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." So evil isn't just evil actions, it's the suppression of truth that causes evil actions to take place. The suppression of truth gives airspace and room for evil to exist. And God is angry with that, and he ought to be. You know, anyone who loves will experience anger. If you love, you will be angry. I have been angry with my children. And I am angry with them sometimes in an unhinged way, and I'm not talking about that. Let's leave that to one side. We can talk about that another time in counselling. But there have been times when I've been rightly angry with my children because they do stupid things and get themselves in trouble, which costs me energy and time and money. And my kids are not that bad. And I'm still get times of being angry at them. And there'd be no parent in this room who hasn't been angry with their children justly and rightly, yeah? And again, I'm putting aside times when you've been unjustly angry. But love, one of the aspects of love is anger. Angry not just at them, but also particularly angry at anything that would choose to try to destroy my children. As I said before, you know, if anyone came into my house when my children were babies and tried to harm them, that someone's going to be dead on the floor pretty soon, either me or them. And that's a right kind of anger. And the anger of God is never unrighteous. God is not unhinged. God's anger is a just anger, and an anger which, if it wasn't there, then you have to doubt whether God was holy. But God is not kind of the invention of the Western cultures of the world, this kind of sweet, benevolent Father Christmas in the sky. No, he's a real father. And a good father is both tender and kind, but also provides discipline and boundaries. And every human problem that comes from deficient parenting is an imbalance on one side of that equation, either not enough kindness and tenderness or not enough discipline and strength. Either way, it produces a problem. But of course, God is perfect. And so God's anger is real and is redemptive. God's anger is not merely punitive, but it brings redemption, and it's restorative in its, or that's its plan. That's where it's going in the long run. But we don't like to talk about an angry God because it brings up images of all of the angry gods down through history, and false ideas about God, and it also is tainted by what I would call unjust authority figures that we've experienced in the past in our own life, like the vicious husband unloading on his abused wife, or the controlling mother manipulating her children through threats and intimidation, or the despotic government controlling its people through violent repression. And I could add to that list infinitely that kind of thing, and that feeds into our anti-anger perspective. We don't want to see that in anyone, not in ourselves or anyone else. And so ideas of God being angry, we sometimes superimpose those kind of abusive anger onto God. And of course, we've also have our imagination made even more fertile by the gods of human invention. Now, the problem with gods of human invention is that they tend to be just like us, only bigger. And so when you look down through history and you see all of the angry gods of human invention, they're always unhinged and capricious, and they seem foreign and repulsive to us. But of course, that kind of God is just that is the unjust and capricious kind of God is just a human invention, like the Greek, the Roman and the Scandinavian gods. For instance, like Odin or Thor or Zeus, when you really examine them, all they are is narcissistic, childish, monstrous recreations of despotic human beings. That's all they are. They're just writ large, that's all. They just magnify the worst of humankind, narcissistic, despotic, monstrous, and then just blow it up 1,000 times and say, that's God. And so you have this image of, Zeus chucking down thunderbolts or of God sitting over a computer with a picture of you on it with the key on the key smite, ready to press the smite button at every indiscretion. But of course, that's a human God. That's not the real God. That's just a human invention. Stephen Fry famously denounced that kind of God, and when he said that God, and I say God in inverted commas here, is utterly evil, capricious and monstrous. And if he were to exist, he goes on to write, it's utterly evil, and why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? You shouldn't respect a God like that. And he's absolutely right, because the real God isn't that God. And as I often say when I'm talking with atheist friends, it's always a good thing to find out what kind of God they don't believe in and say, I don't believe in that God either. I'm an atheist just like you, if that's the God that is, and I don't believe in that God. And what the irony here is that Stephen Fry is angry because of injustice. But God's not allowed to be angry with injustice. He's allowed to be angry with injustice. But he's saying, God's unjust and I'm angry. But what the scriptures say is men are unjust. Women are unjust, and God is angry. How about that? Turn the tables. And God's anger is just. And he ought to be angry. And if he's not, then he is unjust. It means he's, what's a genocide between friends? What sort of God would be like that? That would be terrible. Now, the genuine anger of God is anger with the suppression of truth and its consequent censure of justice. The suppression of truth always leads to injustice. The first move of every despotic government is to censure truth. Anyone who's even has a slight interest in history will know that the first move of every despotic government is to censure truth. And then to censure truth even more. And to suppress truth, and to suppress it even more. And eventually that gives way to injustice and to great levels of human pain. So Paul goes on to write in verse 19, and he says, this is the problem. This is the problem that God is seeing when he looks out on the earth. He says, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what he has made, so the people are without excuse. So put simply, what Paul is saying here is that the truth about God is on public display, it's nakedly exhibited, and it's obvious just in the created world around us. Just in the material world, it's clear to anyone who cares to look that the truth is there on display about who God is. Paul Davies, an English-born astrophysicist and author of many books on the subject of astrophysics, in case you're looking for a bit of light reading, I know for sure that somebody down here would have read all of his books, yeah? He wrote a book called Superforce, The Search for a Grand Unified Theory of Nature, along with a number of other books that are in similar kind of a theme. And he was one of the first astrophysicists to come out very boldly and openly and say, it's pretty obvious there's a God. And the more I look at the physics, the more I believe that. In fact, he went on to write, scientists are slowly waking up to an inconvenient truth. The universe looks suspiciously like a fix. The issue concerns the very laws of nature themselves. For 40 years, physicists and cosmologists have been quietly collecting examples of all too convenient coincidences and special features in the underlying laws of the universe that seem to be necessary in order for life and hence consciousness to exist. Change any one of them and the consequences would be lethal. Fred Hoyle, the distinguished cosmologist, once said, it was as if a super intellect had monkeyed with physics. Like baby bear's porridge in the story of Goldilocks, the universe seems to be just right for life. And, I could have quoted about 50 other quotes by Paul Davies that have a similar kind of view. So what he's saying there is just in the created world, in the material world, it's very clear something of the divine nature of God is seen, his glory is seen. But here's the thing, it's not that we can't see it, it's that we choose not to see it. We say, I will not see it. We don't see it because we don't want to see it, and so we've deliberately suppressed the truth about God so that we can live life independently of him and without reference to him and on our own terms. One of the big giveaways is people talk about my life, what I want to do with my life and my time, as if their life was theirs and their time was theirs. The truth is, your life is not yours, nor is your time. It was created by God and belongs to him, and he has every right to demand your service. So your life is an illusion, and your time is an invention. Your life and your time are God's life in you and God's time given to you. They're gifts from God. But we don't see it that way. We don't want to see it that way because I want to live my life my way. I did it my way. And how did that turn out for you, Dave? Well, when I did that, it didn't turn out that well, actually. So the truth is inconvenient. Like the Pharisees, when they witnessed the raising of Lazarus from the dead, it always strikes me as profound that there were almost certainly Pharisees at the graveside of Lazarus when he was raised from the dead, when Jesus called forth out of the grave a man 4 days dead and he walked out with his grave clothes on. You've got to imagine that. And the next verse after that, you would think would say, so the Pharisees gathered, realised they were wrong about everything that they had been thinking. They repented of their false thinking and became disciples of Jesus. That's what should follow. That should be the next verse. But the next verse is recorded. And so the Pharisees gathered with the scribes in order that they might, and plotted how they might murder Jesus and Lazarus. Because it was an inconvenient truth. Didn't want to see it. And to me, that's a parable of the whole of Western culture. Western culture is just like the Pharisees. We can see the physics, and physics is only the shallow end of the pool, by the way. Physics is 2 inches deep in the ocean of the revelation that's out there. There's a whole other realms that are much deeper and much more profound than that. And we as a whole culture have decided, let's, just like it says in Psalm 2, let's throw off God and his anointed one. We don't want to have to bow down to him. We want to do our own thing and live life our own way. And when that happens, God is angry. And so what happens, the consequence of living in a lie, living without the truth, of course, is you live a lie. And Paul goes on, therefore, to write in verse 21, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings, and birds, and animals, and reptiles. And of course, what he's talking about there, of course, is that people fall into idolatry. Now, the modern word for idolatry is addiction. We fall into addictions, we become slave to things that rule us, and whatever you serve will become your God, and you end up becoming a slave to it. And Paul talked about the literal kind of idols of carved out of stone and so on. But we still do that, I once did a cartoon about a guy who had his iPad out and he was showing an image of someone worshipping a stone idol. And he said, can you believe people would actually, worship a stone idol? How ridiculous is that? And the other guy's going, wow, is that the latest iPod? Man, I really wish I had one of those. But of course, the outcome of trying to live independent of God is actually death. Death on every level, physical, spiritual, social, ecological. Like a ring-bark tree, you can only live for so long. And a human being who is alienated from God is a dead man walking. You might still be walking, but you're dead on the inside. And as I like to say, the physical death of our bodies is just the last manifestation of death that will take place in this life. But you're dead long before that. You're ring-barked in Adam. And humanity is a bunch of dead people walking. And this problem began right back in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve believed the lie that was told to them by Satan. Now, of course, when they decided to go it alone and to alienate themselves from God and say, yeah, we don't need God. We can just live our own life. We can work out what's good and true for ourselves. We don't have to refer to God. The moment they did that, the moment they began to live in that lie, they died. God said to them, if you touch that fruit, you will die. And the moment they touched it, they died, but nothing discernible physically happened to them. But something undiscernible, it's discernible, but not physical, you couldn't see it on the outside, but something substantially changed in the hearts and minds of Adam and Eve on that day. For the first time, Adam and Eve experienced shame as they realised they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. That's exactly what Paul said here. Although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, and they ended up trading in the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like God. And the moment you do that, the moment you die spiritually, shame comes into you because you become less than what you're created to be. You become subhuman, in fact. You know, this is what I like to say about miracles. We think miracles are strange because they seem like they're supernatural, and I say that they're strange to us because we're so used to living subnaturally. What the miracles of Jesus are just depictions of naturalness. They're depictions of the world as it ought to be. They're just the truth, writ large. But we're so used to living in a lie that when we see the truth, it looks like a miracle. And so the life of Jesus is actually a human being who is truly alive, connected with God as Father, knowing him as the true Son, and at one with his fellow human beings and with creation itself. So it's just a revelation of not supernatural but natural to the subnatural world around it. Anyway, that shame, we try to cover ourselves up, as Adam and Eve did. They sewed fig leaves together, and the whole of Western culture has been sewing fig leaves together and trying to cover up their shame. So their nakedness that once used to reveal their glory now exposes their lack of it. And the worst part of this whole thing is that they were so ashamed that Adam and Eve actually hid from God because they'd become corrupted and twisted. Like a key without a lock or a glove without a hand, they became pointless and fruitless and empty. They became, as Paul puts it, futile. Or if I say it about ourselves, put it in the first person. Let me sort of directly quote Paul here, but in the first person saying, or in the third person I should say, we became futile and our foolish hearts were darkened. Although we claimed to be wise, we became fools. Dr. Carl Jung said that concerning his own practice, I don't agree with Carl Jung on many things, but he had some profound insights, and one of them was this. He said that during the past 30 years, people from all of the Western countries of the earth have consulted me, and I have treated many hundreds of patients. Among all my patients in the second half of their life, that is to say, over 35, and some of us fall into that category, there has not been one whose problem in the last resort was not that of finding a religious outlook on life. It is safe to say that every one of them fell ill because they had lost that which the living religions of every age have given their followers, and none of them has been really healed who did not regain his religious outlook. Now, of course, I'm going to say believing in Jesus as the Christ is the only true, authentic thing, but at the very least, having an understanding that there's something bigger and more important than yourself. There's God in the world. However, if we choose not to see this truth, and we refuse to have our identity marked by our relationship to God, and we refuse to find our true home in the fellowship of God, we'll end up inevitably worshipping idols. And the prophet Jeremiah, as we had read out to us before, had something similar to say. When he says about Israel, he says, "But my people have exchanged their glorious God for worthless idols. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they've dug out cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." And then he goes on to describe that's just a metaphor for idolatry. He's saying, here's the real God, who is like a living stream that you can drink at, but instead of drinking at the living stream, they've gone out into the desert and they've dug holes looking for water in the desert, and there's no water there. And so they're drinking sand. That's what idolatry is. And so, and that can never satisfy. There's no way that can bring satisfaction. But how do we learn that? Well, Paul goes on to say that God gave them over to depravity, in fact. Said in verse 24, he said, and I'll list this 3 times he mentions this, verse 24, 26 and 28. It says, God gave them over to their sinful desires and gave their hearts to sexual impurity and to idolatry. And then verse 26, it says, God gave them over to shameful lusts. And then verse 28, he says, and God gave them over to a depraved mind. So depraved is the opposite of praved, by the way. It's a little bit like gruntled and disgruntled. Apparently you can be gruntled. I had a beautiful breakfast this morning. I was well gruntled. But of course, if you're not gruntled, then you're disgruntled, you're unhappy. And the same is true. It's a very old word, it's not used anymore. But you can be praved. Praved means that you're correct, that you're genuine, you're authentic. To be depraved means that you're any of those things, that you're anything but that. And anyway, so he says that the one of the ways that God exhibits his wrath, his anger, is to let us experience the consequences of our choice. Have you ever done that with your children? All right then, have it your way. Have you ever done that? And sometimes, especially when your children are adults, you have to let them experience. You know, my son went away on a camping trip with some of his friends one time, and he was going to take all this stuff, and I said, you won't use all that stuff. He said, yes, we've got plans to do this and this and this. And I said, look, I've done all this. I've been where you've been, and I can tell you right now, you won't use all of that stuff. You won't even use. And this is how this is going to turn out. And he said, no, you don't know what you're talking about. So he went away and he came back and said, you were right about everything. And I said, let that be a lesson to you next time I warn you about anything else. But no, he hasn't taken that to heart at all. He is learning. He's got 2 children now, and he's learning what life's really all about. But anyway, sin is its own curse. Living a depraved life is its own curse. And Paul goes on to talk about that in a certain amount of detail. And he talks about, and he gives the example of, men having sex with other men and women having sex with other women as a kind of an example par excellence of the brokenness of our humanity. But of course, that's just one example. And I don't think he's just picking on that as saying, well, that's really bad. No, he's just saying there's an example of how this turns out. But so there's not a human being on earth who isn't, if they're not giving their allegiance to Christ, who's not depraved. We've all got our weak points. I knew a guy who was a Christian. He couldn't stop himself from gambling. He was an absolute addict to gambling. And he could never save $100. He had a good income and he was poor. Now that's not I've never been tempted by gambling. Not once, not ever. My idea of hell is Sky City. But I've got my own problems, which I'm not going to talk to you about. And you have too. You've all got a weak point. And it's just like a corruption that's come into the whole human race. It's like if you get measles, and a measles appears on the back of your hand, it's not that back of your hand is worse than the other parts of your hand. It's just that's where it manifested. And depravity manifests in humanity in all kinds of different ways, whether it be homosexuality, or whether it be addiction to gambling, or whether it be heterosexual lusts. It's all just depravity. So let's not get too hung up on, this thing or that thing. Having said that, let's not try to justify any of those things either. So this is how, and you've got to understand, Paul was living in a world which, if you read Tom Holland, who's one of the great historians of our day, he was saying the Roman Empire was a particularly cruel and horrible place, and that Christianity changed it. And he's not a Christian, by the way, but he admits that the Roman Empire was despotic It was cruel. It was depraved beyond anything we can even imagine. And it was the Christian faith that turned it around. I've run out of time, but we'll pick this up next week. So, I'm not leaving that on a very happy note. I would say this, though. That of course, what Paul is wanting to do here is simply bring us to the point where we say, we're needy, and the only answer to this is Jesus Christ. You cannot fix yourself. You cannot brave yourself. You need Jesus. And you need to drink at the living stream of God himself and give up on the broken cisterns that you dig out in the desert. Amen.